Well, good morning, and thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Happy, and all the people here. As they mentioned, I'm a Boulder native, and it's fun to come back to where I used to see the Denver Rockets play. The Denver Rockets play. This used to be the auditorium arenas where they played basketball and had graduations, all kinds of things. It's also exciting to be back in a place, as Secretary Salazar and as Happy talked about, that really nurtured me and helped me sort of on my way to becoming a wildlife biologist. I grew up in Boulder, I enjoyed the outdoors in Boulder, and my contacts with nature were very much day-to-day contacts, the experience of walking along Boulder Creek, of playing in Farmer's Ditch, of going to the Boulder Reservoir, of seeing geese at Veely Lake, things like that. So parks were a very big part of that. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is urban biodiversity and try to give you some background on biodiversity in cities, and also talk about biodiversity from the perspective of first why it's important, but also how cities can be involved and how city parks can be involved in maintaining biodiversity in cities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the biodiversity crisis, but I'm really going to focus on things cities can do. So I'm also going to talk, as was mentioned in the introduction, about the importance of biodiversity near where people live, and also the idea that justice is an important part of biodiversity, that you want people in cities, all people, to have the opportunities to experience nature as part of their day-to-day lives. So to start out, we said, well, what's the biodiversity crisis? So the map you're seeing is a map that was done by Karen Cito at Yale University, and what she did was they used projections on urban growth all the cities which are in biodiversity hotspots. And what this map is showing is North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean, and it's showing projected growth for cities and where those protected areas are that are in cities that are currently maintaining biodiversity. So what you're seeing is an example of saying that there's a biodiversity threat because cities are growing. So from the perspective of what CETO says, as this headline says, it says new maps show how urban sprawl threatens the world's remaining biodiversity. This is a landscape architecture website. If you look at the website, you'll see all kinds of maps and photos and illustrations showing how all these cities around the world are essentially a threat to biodiversity. And if you look at what that threat is, this is a slide from Cape Town, South Africa, in one of the parks there. And it says going, going, gone. And it talks about urbanization, the ways that urbanization, all the processes tied in with urbanization impact different species. So you see X's through species which are gone, you see pictures of rare species and so on. So the point that I'm making with this is that there are serious issues about biodiversity, and as Secretary Salazar talked about, what do you want cities to look like when, say, they double in size? When there are more people, when they take up more space. But what I'm going to talk about the rest of today is really trying to understand what biodiversity in cities is about, and then second, how parks in cities and all the things which parks departments do to manage open space in cities can assist in conserving biodiversity. So first, if you think about a definition of biodiversity, biodiversity simply means the species which occur in a region. So you could say the biodiversity in Denver represents all the species of plants and animals which occur inside the city of Denver. But in addition, it includes the habitats that support those species. Now, from a very technical definition, since it's all species, that would include all of what sometimes people call the green, blue, and gray places in cities. So everything where species occur are habitats that support biodiversity. And then finally, a big part of biodiversity are the actual processes that maintain those habitats for different species. So things like fire, flooding, all those things which maintain certain conditions that maintain habitats and then support species. Now, if you think about a definition of urban biodiversity, there's what's urban biodiversity? Well, we already said it's biodiversity in cities, but you could think of biodiversity as occurring at different scales. So we all live somewhere. We live in a house or a condo or an apartment or a duplex or on a farm, or we live somewhere. And at that sort of lot or parcel local scale. You could talk about biodiversity at that scale. You could also talk about biodiversity in your neighborhood, maybe the mile or so around your house where you go every day, where you ride your bike, where you walk, those kinds of things. You could think about biodiversity at that scale. You could think again about biodiversity within a city, or you could think about biodiversity within a larger region. So you might think about, say, biodiversity along the Front Range. You could talk about everything in Colorado, say from Fort Collins, all the way down to Colorado Springs, and say what are the habitats, the species, and the processes that maintain biodiversity across that region. And it's important to think that biodiversity, as we talk about it, occurs in parks and protected areas that all of you are involved in managing, but it also occurs in what ecologists sometimes call the matrix, those places outside of the park boundaries, the places that we often see as being problematic, where there are conflicts, where there are invasive species, where there are people. So biodiversity encompasses both these protected areas, but it also encompasses everything about a city. And finally, biodiversity occurs in a context that involves people. I added some references on here, but Cyril Cillier talks about biodiversity occurring in a socioeconomic context. In other words, things like poverty, things like wealth, things like access to those things matter and shape biodiversity. Biodiversity occurs in a cultural context. That means that people shape biodiversity in cities by what they do, by their traditions, by their histories. And also, the biodiversity in cities, the nature in cities shapes people's culture. So, as you've heard several people say today, I grew up in Boulder. Many people here grew up someplace where that nature's important. You remember the creek where you used to play. You remember the places you hiked. You remember where you saw birds. All those kinds of things are how biodiversity shapes culture. And then finally, the process of planning, design, and management, the things which landscape architects, planners, those folks do, are maintain biodiversity. Maria Ignatieva, who I show on the slide there, talks about how cities are impacted by sort of global patterns of planning and design and management, which shape things like lawns and what parks look like and those kinds of things. So all these things, planning and design, culture and socioeconomic factors, all shape biodiversity because they're the human aspects of biodiversity in cities. Now, I'm going to shift gears for a second and talk about actually a project that I've been involved in with several other people in several cities around the world. So over the past 10 years, I've been involved with a couple different projects to try to categorize biodiversity in cities by looking at actual data. So in 2014, we published a paper that talks about the results of looking just at birds and plants in cities. And these are studies where we actually looked at data that were compiled where they have an entire list. So what that means is you might say, here's a list of all the species of birds which occur in Denver, Colorado, or here's a list of all the plant species which occur in Columbia, Missouri. So instead of looking at a single site, this is the entire city. So we had data on these from 147 cities, roughly 103 cities with bird data, and 55 cities with plant data. And I'm going to have two data slides on here, so if you took ecology, you can go back and relive that. If you didn't, we'll explain what that means. But these are what are called species accumulation curves, and what they show are how many new species you get each time you look at a different list from a city. And you see that these curves are both kind of still going up. They're not really leveling off. So what that means is of the 55 cities we looked at for birds and the 104 for plants, it means that as you add more cities, you're getting more species. And you might say, well, why is that important? Well, here's why it's important. It's important because people often say, you know, cities are bad for nature. You go to a city, they're all the same. All you see are pigeons and starlings and dandelions and just common species. But what this suggests is that cities are unique and they capture lots of species from their region. And we'll talk more about this in a second. Okay, so here we see our data. Now, there are three important things we're going to talk about. First, the different colors. So the different colors represent what are basically biogeographic regions of the world. And what that means is these are places which are more or less similar compared to other regions. So for example, North America is different from South America, which is different from Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, ecologically. And then what we're showing on the bottom left are data about plants. On the bottom right are data about birds. And the E's on those graphs mean exotic species, and the N's mean native species. So what we're trying to show here are, if you go to a city in a region, do you expect to see more native species or more non-native species? Now, the popular answer you often think about is, well, you go out in the park, you see things like Russian olive, honeysuckle, garlic mustard, all kinds of non-native species. You see pigeons and starlings, so you say, oh, you see more non-native species. But actually, in all the cities and all these regions, you see more native species on these species list than non-native species. So what this points to is the importance of cities in providing habitat for lots of native species, as well as a few non-native species. And if you look at the sort of heights of these bar graphs, it suggests that places in, say, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, and so on, have really high levels of biodiversity, which correspond to where high levels of biodiversity are globally. And you also see that where there are lots of non-native species are places like Australia, New Zealand, and you'll hear a talk about that a little later on. Okay, and then finally with this study, we said, well, what best predicts the number of species you see in a city? And there are two things. First, just the size of a city. So bigger cities have more species, but bigger cities that are more built up, that also can be a negative factor for biodiversity. So the other variable that's really important is the amount of green space. So if you think about the amount of open space, has vegetation on it, that's the most important factor in biodiversity across all these cities. So we're going to talk about this now. And then our final slide about cities, which is important, is that, again, sometimes you hear a term biotic homogenization, which simply says that cities are becoming more alike, and in terms of their species. And what this graph says is, it says that if you look at Singapore, Singapore is not like La Paz, Bolivia, or Cayenne, French Guiana. They have different species there. So it's simply saying that when we look at actually how alike cities are from each other, they kind of group together by the regions where they occur. So cities in Southwest United States or on the Front Range are going to be a lot more alike than cities in the Midwest and Missouri where I am. Okay. So finally, all this leads to what's really important about management. And you could think of cities as being like a filter. So cities filter biodiversity, they filter regional pool of species. And conservation and management are important because they help ameliorate how cities filter species. So this is a graph just showing how these filters work. So at the top, you see the regional pattern. In other words, that's what makes Colorado different from Missouri. So there's a regional pattern of climate and biogeography, and then you add in land use, and that's what makes regions different from each other. And so there's a regional species pool, which says, here are the species of plants and animals you see in Colorado, here are the species of plants and animals you see in Missouri. And factors within that about people and the things they do influence that regional pool, and so that leads to what you see within the city. And then there are things like what the city looks like, its history, its form, its age, socioeconomic and cultural factors, and so on, and those things shape ultimately what you see at an actual site. So there are things that act on the city pool, and that influences what you see on the site. So we're going to use this kind of framework to think about managing biodiversity in cities, and we're going to use a couple examples from Columbia, Missouri, and from Baltimore, Maryland to do this. Okay. So when we think about managing places for cities, managing places for biodiversity in cities, and you're thinking about managing biodiversity, and you think about green spaces. So city parks and people who work for city parks manage all kinds of places. They manage remnant areas, they manage riparian corridors, that Secretary Salazar mentioned, they manage vacant lands, they manage parks, they sometimes have programs that work with homeowners, and sometimes they manage green roofs. So all these are things which people who work on managing biodiversity in cities, which often includes city parks, can include. And you see in here that obviously as you get more to the more built up parts of the city, what you have to do to maintain these habitats costs a lot. It involves a lot of management compared to some of the remnant sites, which have different kinds of issues. But all these places are places that can be managed with biodiversity. So we're going to start out with an example of a role that a city might play, and this is where I live and work, Columbia, Missouri. It focuses on grassland birds. This is actually work done by the U.S. Forest Service, which has a lab on the University of Missouri campus, and work by Frank Thompson and Dirk Burhans with the city. So this is Grindstone Nature Area, and Grindstone Nature Area actually is in the middle of the city of Columbia. It's in the Hinkson Creek Valley, which sort of divides the city in half, and this looks very pristine, very natural. You sort of ignore the fact there's a 4-lane road sort of through the middle of the back part of the picture and some other things, but this is roughly a 200-acre site that was a dairy farm, that was a farm, and now is being managed as a nature area primarily for grassland habitat. And what the city is focusing on, along with the Forest Service, is on a particular set of species which are rare and declining throughout the Midwest. These are grassland and shrubland birds. So, for example, blue-gray gnatcatchers, yellow-breasted chats, those types of species are declining regionally in the Midwest through habitat loss, through things like loss of fire and grazing, and they'll occur in the region and they also occur in Columbia. So the city's been working with the Forest Service on managing these species. And as part of this project, they looked at things like nest survival in urban parks. They looked at 4 nature areas in the city, which all have this mix of grassland and shrubland. And they identified particular areas they could focus on. They looked at managing vegetation height and plant species composition, reducing mowing and maintaining mowing, and then, reduce mowing in some places, maintaining mowing in other places, and then working with adjacent residents to manage invasive species and so on. Now, again, as I mentioned, this park occurs in this bigger context, and I'm going to talk about this bigger context for the rest of my talk. So this park occurs near the University of Missouri campus, near lots of student housing, near apartment complexes, condos, all kinds of different settings. Which leads to this question about how do you manage biodiversity in the matrix? How do you manage biodiversity in places like vacant lots and people's backyards, all these kinds of things? So the idea about managing this matrix is that the matrix is something called everyday nature, which is a concept developed by Rachel Kaplan and Stephen Kaplan, and they talk about where people encounter nature every day, where they see it, where they live, the places they value, and also where they make decisions about nature. So everyday nature is also a place where there are big issues about environmental justice. So we think about everyday nature is where people encounter nature, but people encounter nature in different kinds of settings and different places. So in Baltimore, Maryland, as part of the Baltimore LTER project, we've looked at things like what sets up where people experience nature and how people experience nature differently. And in Baltimore, it's things like the level of education in your neighborhood, the percent of black residents in your neighborhood, the number of people on public assistance, and then the length of time you've lived in your neighborhood. All those things shape what Baltimore looks like in terms of nature. So we see 2 things. On the left shows the pattern of predominantly African American neighborhoods in Baltimore, and the darker areas indicate they have a higher percentage of black residents, and the graphic on the right shows number of bird species people encounter. And so what it suggests is that if you look particularly on the left-hand side of the picture of Baltimore, that the areas which have a large number of black residents tend to have fewer bird species. And again, they have fewer bird species because they have different kinds of habitats than other places in the city. Those habitats are maintained differently and so on. So the idea of saying, how do you make Baltimore or Columbia or Denver or Boulder a city where people have better opportunities to experience nature and a more wide variety of nature are important management questions around biodiversity. So the example we're going to show is an example of a graduate student that worked at Missouri, Christine Rager-Brodsky, and who looked at biodiversity, everyday nature, birds, and vacant lots. And in Baltimore, the city's involved with managing vacant lots. So in general, she found that the slide or the picture on the left would be a typical neighborhood, a lot in a typical neighborhood in West Baltimore. The slide on the right shows vacant lots more on probably the north and northeast side of Baltimore. Now it's interesting to point out that Baltimore is a predominantly African American city, and so that many of the places which are wealthier neighborhoods are also predominantly African American neighborhoods. But the issue here is the role of sort of poverty and socioeconomic decline and things like that, and biodiversity. So she found that lots in some neighborhoods have fewer trees, smaller trees, more artificial surface, compared to more trees, more shrubs, more grass. And if you think about birds, birds like things like trees, shrub, and grass. So these open spaces here have less habitat for certain species, and she's thinking about how could you manage that. So as part of this project, she looked at a range of sites around the city. She looked at 150 vacant lots, and she found that 60 bird species use the lots, that there are about 64 species of plants and 47 species of shrubs on there. And she found that about 10 or so species actually nest on those lots. And the big differences on these lots are primarily the amount of shrub cover. So kind of shrub cover things about that tall. That's where birds nest. So she found that these places which are important for birds were places that have lots of shrubs, and there was a difference between neighborhoods and between socioeconomic factors in neighborhoods that were associated with these differences in shrub cover in vacant lots. So what she understands too is that there's a very complex set of factors about these lots. For example, lots represent community change, often negative community change. Lots are viewed in some places as being unsafe. Lots are viewed as being places where there's a lack of neighborhood care, or where the city's not investing maintenance into the lots. And so all these things kind of shape the wildlife and habitat that's there, and they also shape the opportunity for managing these places and for trying to provide additional habitat. So to talk just briefly, this graphic actually comes from work we're doing in St. Louis with a thing called the Green City Coalition to look at potential management of vacant lots, along with many other groups and researchers around St. Louis and Columbia. And all of these, they're talking about this idea of saying, how do you engage people, and working with the city and working with parks departments and various other organizations to really think about these places, think about how you make places that people will use, that they'll enjoy, and that also attain biodiversity outcomes. So basically, how people perceive these lots has a lot to do with how they're being managed, and ultimately how they drive for biodiversity. So this is the ideal lot for things like robins, mourning doves, and cardinals, and other shrub nesting species. And these kinds of lots are uniformly hated by people in most cities because they say they're dangerous. They look trash-filled. They have people go in there and they sell drugs, and there's prostitution, there are all these kind of things. You can't see through them. So all these things are considered issues. But what the challenge in Baltimore and St. Louis and other places around these kinds of places, and all the places that are managed, are how do you link people and what they value with opportunities for managing urban biodiversity. So even though you may be managing a place that is more pristine, it still involves people. Even though you may be managing a traditional city park, it still involves people. So this idea of saying, how do you link what we know about urban biodiversity, the scientific knowledge, the practical knowledge of management, the expertise managers and designers and all those people have, how do you tie that in with what people actually want and perceive? And that's going to be the key to really managing biodiversity in cities. The last slide is of a place called The Quiet Place, which is a neighborhood growing space in Baltimore. And it's one of the places that actually had nesting birds, and I kind of like that because it represents some of the opportunities which exist. And this was actually a community-led effort where they work with the city on doing the plannings and so on in there. And so I think it's a nice way to end the talk. Thank you again for the invitation to participate. I think I'm going to be on the panel later on, and thank you for your attention.